Okay, now that the problem and solution are taken care of, the next big step is to validate this idea. Is this solution someone that someone would buy? Does it actually solve the problems that people have? So to answer this question, I point you to another book. Two other books, actually. One's called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and the other's The Startup Owner's Manual, both of them written by Steve Blank. Right? Steve Blank, who also teaches an online class called the Lean Launchpad or called How to Start a Startup. And I suggest that after you run through this process, take a look at his process as well. Now, Steve's big idea in those books was that we were doing business planning all wrong for years and years and years. Steve's big idea was that we were doing business planning wrong for years and years and years. What he calls the product development model was how we did this 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And it goes like this. You sit down and you do some market research. You go out, perhaps talk to some customers, do a lot of digging, and figure out what you think the customers need. Then you go and design the product based on that research. You build the product, and that process often took 12, 18, 24 months. Now, at the end of that build cycle, you then had an alpha or a beta version of your product. You would show it to a few select customers, make sure they didn't have any big issues with it. They would give you some feedback, but at this point, really the feedback was this little thing doesn't work, that little thing doesn't work. You can't make big changes because you've already spent 12 or 18 months building it. Then you launch. You have a big, giant launch for this product. And in the end, you hope that everything goes well because it's going to take you 12 or 18 months to iterate through to do another process. This is called the waterfall model. We've seen this in software. We still see it in hardware, right? Hardware comes out once a year. There's a new tablet once a year. There's a new, set of phones, not necessarily one phone. Once a year, there's a new operating system that comes out for our PCs every 3 or 4 years. Right? New car models, new this, new that. It's not an uncommon model. But there's a flaw in this model. And the flaw is that it takes a long time between the time you talk to customers and the time you have something for them to actually see. So, the poster child in the 4 Steps to the Epiphany using this model is Webvan. You may not have remembered Webvan. It was a startup back in the .com era, and they had a problem they thought people had, which was people had to go to stores in order to buy groceries. Now, maybe you have this problem yourself. I don't know how you get groceries, but the people at Webvan thought this was a big, important problem that they were going to solve by creating a website, right, and home delivery. And so they created a huge, big, complicated plan. And that plan said there were going to be 10,000 customers on the first month. So in order to serve 10,000 customers, they needed to have their own warehouses. They couldn't just go to the nearest supermarket and pack up the goods and bring it to people's homes. So they built their own warehouse. And they thought, well, this plan is correct. We're going to have 10,000 people in the first month growing to whatever, 100,000 people in the first year or so. We better automate that warehouse. So they raised a huge amount of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they hired a huge staff to build software to make this automated warehouse and to build this brand new website that had a great user experience for buying groceries, and so on and so on. So by the time they launched, they had 200 people working for this company and no customers yet, right? No revenues, but 200 employees who had built this big complicated system, and they put it out there in the market. And, well, you can guess, they did not get 10,000 customers. Well, what did they do? Well, the management said the plan said there were 10,000 customers to be had. The marketing team must have failed us. So they fired the marketing team. The sales team must have failed us. They fired the sales team and so forth. And they pushed forward. And as what happened with most .com startups, they ran out of money, they went out of business. And the flaw here is that they started with this humongous investment and no customers rather than talking to the customers and starting small. So, Steve's big idea was that companies fail because they have a lack of customers, not because they have a lack of product or service. What they do have a flaw in, though, is that they're bringing the wrong product or service, and therefore they're not getting enough customers. And the question is, how can you be sure? How can you best ensure that what you're bringing to market is what customers will actually buy? And so he came up with the customer development model to help solve that problem. There's 4 parts to this, and let's walk through them one at a time. So you start with customer discovery, which sounds a whole lot like market research. You go and you talk to potential customers, find out who they are, how they're solving the problem that you think you're solving, what their needs are, what are their pains, what are their gains, and so forth. And a key is that you're going to do this fairly quickly. Again, weeks or months, hopefully not years for this stage. You may be able to do this online. You may be able to go and find surveys like the Pew surveys that answer a lot of these questions for you. You may go and create your own surveys to get some customer information. And in all cases, you're going to go and get outside the building. When you watch Steve's talk, when you read his books, you'll hear this phrase over and over again. You're not going to answer all your questions and solve all your problems by sitting at a desk. You got to get outside the building and go talk to real customers, as many as you can. Now, you're going to create a questionnaire, you're going to go get your answers, you're going to go and refine that questionnaire, and you're going to repeat this process as often as you need to, right? That's what that circle is representing. You're iterating through this process until you think you have an answer to what people need. You're probably going to talk to 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 customers face to face to get those answers. And if you're doing an online product, you're going to look for hundreds and hundreds or thousands of responses to surveys and interactions in order to get those answers. And when you're there, when you finally have all that information, either you're going to decide to continue iterating because it's not the answer that you want to hear, or you're ready to move on to the next step. The next stage is customer validation. So what you're going to do in this stage is go back out to more potential customers, some that you've talked to, but ideally some new potential customers that haven't heard this story yet. And you're going to bring them the problem and the solution, and you're going to ask them questions like, if I gave this to you right now, would you take it? Would you take my product and my service, and would you use it right now in your business? You're going to ask that question about free because what you want to know is whether or not it's an important enough issue, if it's an important enough problem that this customer will actually buy it or not. What you'll find, and we'll talk about this later in sales, but what you'll find is that many problems out there are known to customers, but they're not high enough priority that they'll do anything about them. They're not high enough priority that they would pay $1 to solve that problem. And so the first bit of validation you need to understand is whether or not it's high enough priority that they would use it at all if it were free. And if they say yes to that, then you can do a follow-up question. What Steve did back at his old business was ask, would you pay $1 million for this? Which may sound a lot for what you're working on. He was selling software that was about $500,000, so twice the price. So pick a number that seems a little bit too high and ask them, well, would you pay $1 million or $1,000 or $100 for this solution? And most of them will say no, because you've picked a price that's too high, but some of them will say yes. And what's interesting when you have these conversations is that some of them will give you more information. They will say, no, I can't afford $1 million, but I have a budget for X. Whatever X is, $100,000, $50,000, $10,000, $10. Or I have signing authority to sign off on a project that is $10,000, $5,000, $1,000. By having these conversations with actual potential customers, you learn something about the market. Now you continue doing this until you're satisfied that what you're working on will actually sell, and then you move on to the next stage. The next stage is customer creation. Now in this stage, again, you're going to get out of the building and you're going to go talk to more potential customers, but this time you're going to bring with you a polished sales deck. And what I mean by that is you're going to have a pitch. You're going to have a sales pitch that will talk about the problem and the solution and the price, the actual price that you would like them to buy your service or your product. And you're going to ask them to buy it. And now at this stage, just to be clear, it doesn't exist. So you may have to backtrack a bit, and you may have to take pre-orders. You may have to do a little bit of song and dance. And we'll get to another way to do this in a moment. But you're going to bring them in the actual sales pitch. And what you'll find in doing that, like every other sales pitch, most people will say no. What you'll find if you go back to those 20, 30, 50 customers that you did the first stage with, is that most of them now, even though they told you it was a good idea back then, will not buy your product or service. Right? As soon as you put a price on it, fewer people will say yes. But you're having a conversation, and so in this conversation, what you want to learn is, why are they saying no? Are you missing something that they really need before they say yes? Or is it simply not a high enough priority for them to buy it right now? Is it a timing issue? You have to wait for next year's budget. Having those conversations will get you those answers. And once you have those answers and the pre-sales and all this knowledge about what will actually sell, then finally you move on to the last stage. And in the last stage, you build the company. So just to be clear, this is the total polar opposite to Webvan. Webvan built a company and an automated warehouse, and it had a huge number of employees before they knew whether any one person, any one customer would ever want to shop online for real, for money. This method that Steve outlines is the opposite of that. In this method, you do all this work up front to know that you have something worth building, and then you go build it. And this makes sense in terms of building a real company that needs some funding. So if you go out to the world and do all this research, which is basically what this is, and you walk out of that process with 20 or 100 or 1,000 orders in your hand, and you walk over to an investor, well, again, we'll talk about funding in a bit as well. But if you walk up to an investor and say, I have firm orders, or non-firm orders, I have orders for 1,000 units at this price for this amount of money, right? I have $100,000 worth of orders, then the conversation you have with that investor is way simpler than, I have a great idea, here's the problem I'm solving, here's the solution, here are the customers. You have a completely different conversation with funders or with team members, because you're going to need a team to build this. And so again, if you're going out to someone to recruit them into your startup, and you say, I have a great idea, and I've talked to some people, and they all say they like it, that's one thing. If you walk up to someone that you're trying to recruit and you say, I have an idea, here it is, and we have orders for 100,000 units as soon as we build it, that's a totally different conversation, right? So as much as you can, follow this model to know that what you're working on is truly validated before you go off and try and raise money and try and recruit a team and try and do everything else that costs money. What you'll find as you go through this process is that you'll learn a whole lot more about your business by talking to potential customers than you will sitting through these lectures just listening to how you put together a business plan.